Hi, this is Lindsay Bottoms doing a lecture on nutrition for cardiovascular health. Okay, so just going to give you an overview of what's going to be covered in the next 30 minutes or however long this is going to take. First of all, we're going to literally consider what is cardiovascular disease, what causes cardiovascular disease. We're going to briefly discuss the diet heart hypothesis, touch on what metabolic syndrome is, and then look at what is the Mediterranean diet. Following that, I will attach another document which you've already received, which is the quiz that I did on nutrition for cardiovascular health. And I will talk through the answers as well on another podcast. So, in terms of what cardiovascular disease is, again, it's with many things, there's several definitions, but I think it's quite nice to look at the British Heart Foundation, and their definition is cardiovascular disease includes all the diseases of the heart and circulation, including coronary heart disease, angina, heart attack, congenital heart disease, and stroke. It's also known as heart and circulatory disease. So that's the definition by the British Heart Foundation. If we look at the different forms of cardiovascular disease, we have coronary heart disease, and this is where you get the fatty acid plaques building up in the arteries, which then blocks the arteries. It's probably the most common one. We've also got hypertension, and hopefully you all know what normal blood pressure should be, and that should be 120/80. If someone's suffering from hypertension, they've probably got blood pressure in the region of about 140 millimeters of mercury over about 90 millimeters of mercury. So that's what we'd class as hypertension. And if someone's got that over a long period of time, then it's detrimental to health. Then there's also stroke, and stroke is where you get a block in blood to the brain, and that's known as a stroke. There's congenital heart disease, where there's something wrong from birth, so that some people unfortunately have this. There's rheumatic heart disease, which actually is you end up with rheumatic fever, and that ends up causing a problem to the valves in the heart, and it can lead to rheumatic heart disease. You can also end up with congestive heart failure, other diseases of the arteries like peripheral arterial disease, and you can end up with arrhythmias. So all these are different forms of cardiovascular disease. And if we actually look at some statistics on the Department of Health website, you can actually see that deaths by cause in men in 2014, if you look at the top graph, 28% of the deaths are actually cardiovascular disease. So all the ones in sort of the red colours and the pinks. So you can see that hypertensive diseases was 1% of the deaths, coronary heart disease is 15%, other heart disease is 4%, stroke 6%, and diseases of arteries, arterioles, and capillaries is 2%. So 28% is quite a large percentage, and not all of them. Some of them are genetic, but a lot of this can be improved with exercise and diet. If you look at cancer, that's actually the biggest killer in men, and 32% of deaths are down to cancer. So cardiovascular disease is the second biggest killer in men. For women, it's slightly lower at 26% for cardiovascular disease, and you can see similar for hypertensive disease. Coronary heart disease is definitely lower in women. Other heart diseases is 5%, stroke is 8%, and the other ones are at 1%. Cancer is slightly lower as well in women, and it's about 27%. So there isn't much difference between cancer and cardiovascular disease in women. So as I've already mentioned, cardiovascular disease, not all cases, but there are many cases that can be improved with improving general well-being and health. If we look at the causes of men under 75, because obviously once people get over 75, something at the end of the day, unfortunately, something is going to end someone's life, and there's a longer chance for things to happen. But under 75, I think it's quite important to look at what causes death, and actually a larger percentage is down to cancer, which is 38%, but down to cardiovascular disease is 25%, so it's slightly lower. In terms of women, it's only 17% is the cause for cardiovascular disease. So at least they're lower, under 75%, but they're still quite high for the fact that most of these things that we can have an impact on. If you go onto the British Heart Foundation, actually this was actually taken from there, and it's just some statistics, but in one, like if you were just to look at today, approximately 435 people will lose their lives to cardiovascular disease. That's an incredible amount of people. More than 110 people will be younger than 75. 7 million people fight their daily battles with cardiovascular disease. 515 people will go to hospital due to a heart attack. 190 people will die from a heart attack. And unfortunately, 12 babies will be diagnosed with a heart defect. So these statistics are quite incredible if we're looking at cardiovascular disease. I appreciate with the babies, unfortunately, there's nothing we can really do. But in a lot of other cases with cardiovascular disease, if we can improve nutrition and we can improve lifestyle, then we could actually reduce these statistics quite significantly. In terms of coronary heart disease, what tends to happen is that you get damage to the vessels that go to the heart. So what ends up happening is you get a build-up of plaque on the inner walls of the arteries, and this is known as atherosclerosis. And those plaque, you end up getting inflammation. That ends up causing a fibrous wall to be developed, and then it gets more inflammation and it just builds up, and eventually it blocks the artery and it blocks the blood going to the heart. And that ends up leading to a myocardial infarction, which is known as a heart attack, and you can end up with death of that part of the heart muscle. It can unfortunately lead to death in people if it's not treated immediately. Then there's certain markers that you can look at to see if someone's having a coronary heart disease. There's homocysteine, but also high sensitivity C-reactive protein. But that high sensitivity C-reactive protein actually is found in a lot of diseases, so it's not always the best biomarker. But if someone's having a heart attack, that will be elevated. So this is just showing you a diagram of the atherosclerosis. So you can see at the top the normal artery, and then underneath you can see a cross section. So the first one is the normal artery, and then you can see there's a little bit of fatty acid buildup, and then it's even greater. So as I mentioned, what's happening is you get this fatty material accumulating in the lining of the artery wall, and then this causes inflammation, and that inflammation is repaired, or it repairs this inflammation by building some fibrous material over that fatty core. And then over time this forms another plaque which consists of the fatty material, and this just builds up and eventually blocks, and it builds up this big plaque and ends up blocking the artery. If we were to look at cholesterol and lipoproteins, and we've talked about this already in the fat metabolism lecture, we have different types. We've got low density lipoprotein, which is your LDLs, and that's known as bad cholesterol. That actually carries cholesterol into the arteries and ends up causing that's where some of the plaques occur in the arteries. The high density lipoprotein takes the cholesterol to the liver away from the arterial walls. And actually this is known as good cholesterol. So you want high levels of HDL, but you want low levels of LDL. So if we want to improve the cholesterol levels, it's something we've always believed is you want to reduce your saturated fat intake, you want to reduce your cholesterol intake, and reduce caloric intake to control weight. So just reduce your general calorie intake. So this is something we've sort of had a long-standing belief of. If we look at the dietary fat metabolism, which you've covered already, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but you can see that the fat is digested, it forms a chylomicron, it gets broken down by the lipoprotein lipase, and you get fatty acids. It can also reform the chylomicron and go to the liver, and LDLs you can end up with LDLs in the blood, and that gets taken, it takes the cholesterol to the tissues. So generally that's our fat metabolism, but go and look at it in the lecture on the fat metabolism. It goes into a lot more detail and explains a little bit better the roles of the LDL and also the HDL. But essentially, we've already mentioned that we want greater levels of HDL in comparison to LDLs. Also, we don't want too much of the chylomicrons and the VLDLs because they're carrying the triacylglycerides around in the blood. So we tend to want lower levels of those. So when we were to say do a health check on someone, actually we take a little bit of blood sample and we check for HDL, LDL, and also triglycerides in the blood. Because we don't want so much triglycerides. So, and also we want the low levels of LDL and the high levels of HDL. If we look at the classifications of fatty acids, we've already mentioned we have the saturated fatty acids and we have the unsaturated fatty acids. Saturated fatty acids we want to keep to a minimum. That's where we tend to have a lot of bad cholesterol as such. The unsaturated fatty acids actually have fatty acids that can be beneficial for health. And you've got your we've got the monounsaturated fatty acids, the polyunsaturated fatty acids. The polyunsaturated fatty acids actually break down or have two subgroups. You've got omega-6 and your omega-3s. And these obviously can be found in fish and nuts, and these are known as very good healthy fatty acids, and we want to make sure we have an element of these in our diets. There has been an association with decreased mortality with these polyunsaturated fatty acids, and it suggested that it can reduce disease, increase including cardiovascular disease, and also reduce the chances of cancer and cognitive impairments. We have something called the diet-heart hypothesis, and this has been around for 100 years. It's this belief that if we eat saturated fat, it's going to increase our blood cholesterol levels. And this is one of the theories that Tim Noakes is trying to argue against in his battle to try and get high-fat diets approved. Because this hypothesis has been around for a very long time, but it hasn't really been proven. So we have this belief that saturated fat increases blood cholesterol levels. Cholesterol is deposited on the arteries, as we've mentioned earlier, and it can lead to coronary heart disease. So the belief is therefore we do not want to eat much saturated fat. But the problem is, it is a nice theory, but it hasn't been scientifically proven to the highest level. So there is actually still some debate about whether this diet-heart hypothesis is really true. And as I said, this is one of the arguments that the likes of Tim Noakes uses for the high-fat diet. If you look at, I think I've mentioned it before, but if you were to look at cholesterol levels around the world, somewhere like Switzerland actually has some of the highest cholesterol levels in the world, but actually some of the lowest cardiovascular disease levels. And this is one of the arguments saying that maybe this diet-heart hypothesis isn't as accurate as we've always believed it to be. But it's generally what we stand by, and there is this concept that high cholesterol can lead to cardiovascular disease. If we look at the increased risk of cardiovascular disease, there's several factors that can influence it. We can have genetic variation, so genetics does affect it. Some people are just more at risk of cardiovascular disease. Some people genetically have hypertension. You can end up with lipid disorders, so obviously the elevation of LDLs and the low levels of HDLs and high levels of triglycerides. Type 2 diabetes can increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. So therefore, obviously, if you're overweight and you end up and you have glucose intolerance, then this does generally increase your chance. High levels of C-reactive protein, CRP, increases your cardiovascular risk. And as I said before, this high CRP is actually found in many diseases. So something like diabetes causes an elevation of CRP. Something like Actually, Alzheimer's has an elevation of CRP. So that a lot of chronic diseases have this. So it's quite difficult to say that that's going to lead on to increased cardiovascular risk. But something with exercise, the HIIT exercise, the high intensity interval training, that type of exercise has actually been shown to reduce inflammation or systemic inflammation. So something like HIIT could improve cardiovascular risk purely, well, not purely, but one of the reasons is because it can reduce systemic inflammation. But going back to this, obesity can cause increased cardiovascular risk, and actually obesity can also lead to high CRP. Metabolic syndrome, and metabolic syndrome I'll come back to in a minute to explain what that is. Your age can influence. Obviously, as you get older, you get an increased chances of cardiovascular disease. Different ethnicity has a greater chance of cardiovascular disease, and I guess that's down to genetics. Sex, we've already shown that there was more men with cardiovascular disease than women. A prior cardiovascular event, so if you've already had one, you're more at risk. Smoking increases your cardiovascular disease risk, and also physical inactivity. But all these things tend to be interlinked because obviously physical inactivity can lead to obesity, and they're all sort of interlinked. Hypertension, chronic hypertension can also lead to increased cardiovascular risk. So all these factors can affect it. If we look at what metabolic syndrome is, I said I'd come to that. Again, it's quite nice to go back and have a look at the definition on the British Heart Foundation website. They say that metabolic syndrome is the medical term used when several risk factors for heart and circulatory disease, all related to the body's metabolism, occur together. This puts you at a greater risk of a heart attack or stroke or developing diabetes. So basically, if we were to look at the criteria to diagnose someone with metabolic syndrome, it's a bit different for men than it is for women. But essentially, so this is in American terminology, but waist circumference for men is going to be greater than 40 inches. For women, it's 35 inches. Triglycerides, it's going to be greater than 150 milligrams per deciliter. For women, it's same. The cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, you want someone who's got a metabolic syndrome is going to have less than 40 milligrams per deciliter for men and below 50 for women. Blood pressure, you can see it's elevated blood pressure. It's not quite high blood pressure, but it's elevated blood pressure. And you can see it influences the fasting blood glucose as well for both. So they need to have 3 of these 5 criteria to have or be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. And that basically means that at greater risk of having diabetes and also cardiovascular disease. Actually, if you end up talking to Tarun, who's one of the PhD students here, he's doing a project on metabolic syndrome, and he's looking at using cherry juice to improve metabolic syndrome to see if it decreases blood pressure and has any impact on these triglycerides and cholesterol levels. This is just a diagram trying to show you what happens. Obviously, someone who's really healthy is going to live for a long period of time. They start developing metabolic imbalance because of their diet, which then ends up leading to metabolic syndrome. So they've ended up with something like high blood pressure, high LDLs, high triglycerides, and they've got an increase in body mass. This can actually then lead on to diabetes. So about 80% of the cases of metabolic syndrome lead on to full-on diabetes. And that can then obviously lead to cardiovascular disease such as cancer, stroke, and heart attacks. So you can see that it can all interlink and unfortunately increase mortality. So one way to start trying to improve health, or in particular cardiovascular health, is to look at diet. And one diet that people seem to have spent a lot of time looking at is the Mediterranean diet. It has been shown that people in the Mediterranean tend to live longer and have less chance of cardiovascular disease. So people have started to look at that diet, and basically Mediterranean diet seems to be high in olive oil. So there seems to be an abundant use of olive oil. They have a high consumption of plant foods. They have a moderate amount of wine, so it's not high levels, but there is they tend to have a glass of their meal. They don't drink excessively. It's thought that it's due to the anthocyanins in the wine, which when I talked about Turin looking at cherry juice, there's actually anthocyanins in the cherry juice. So it's these that are potentially having a beneficial effect. The Mediterranean diet has a moderate consumption of fish and seafood. They also have the fermented dairy products, poultry and eggs. And they got low consumption of red and processed meat and sweets. So generally, this is what's found in the Mediterranean diet. And there was a big study, the PREDIMED study, which looked at the Mediterranean diet on the cardiovascular health. And this was done in Spain. And what they found was that actually that Mediterranean diet improved cardiovascular disease, the risk, so it reduced the risk of cardiovascular disease by about 30% over a period of time. So it does show that there is that this diet potentially improves health, and in particular with the extra virgin oil. So this is maybe a diet to consider if we're looking to improve cardiovascular disease. We've talked about we had our debate in class whether high fat diets versus high carb diets might be beneficial. Another diet to consider is something like the Mediterranean diet, which generally is actually an all-round diet. It's most things in moderation, but it is quite high in anthocyanins, and it's high in polyunsaturated fatty acids as well. There is one more video, a video clip that I would like to show you. I will leave you to play that in your own time rather than me playing it and recording it on here. But it's worthwhile having a look at. And this Dr. Mike Evans, he actually uses academic sources for his videos, and actually does it in a very interesting way. So I really would like you to have a look at that video, and it talks a little bit about the Mediterranean diet as well, and it'd be really good to have a look at that, and generally just what makes a healthy diet. So that was all I really wanted to cover in this lecture part. What I will do is do another video to go through the quiz that I wanted to do. But hopefully that's made up a little